I forgot my wallet that morning, and that small mistake is the only reason I found out what my daughter-in-law was really doing in my house. I remember standing on the sidewalk just outside my driveway, the early autumn air crisp against my skin, my grocery list folded neatly in my hand. I had just locked the front door, mentally going over what I needed to buy: milk, eggs, a few fresh vegetables, nothing extravagant. At 71, my life had become simple, predictable, quiet. And for the most part, I told myself I preferred it that way. But as I reached into my purse to grab my car keys, my fingers brushed against nothing but the lining. No wallet. I froze for a moment, frowning slightly, trying to recall if I had moved it the night before. I was certain I had placed it on my dresser, right next to the small jewelry box my late husband had given me decades ago. I let out a soft sigh, turning back toward the house. It was a minor inconvenience, nothing more. Or at least, that's what I thought at the time. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked back up the driveway, the quiet of the neighborhood wrapping around me like it always did. No cars passing, no voices nearby, just the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, expecting the same stillness I had left just moments ago. But something felt off. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was just a subtle shift, like the air itself had changed. I stood there for a second longer than usual, my hand still resting on the doorknob, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft sound coming from upstairs. A movement. A drawer, perhaps. I frowned, my heart giving a slow, unfamiliar thud. That didn't make sense. My son Daniel and his wife Ashley were both supposed to be at work. They had left just after 8, as they always did. I watched them leave from the kitchen window, just like I did every morning, out of habit more than anything else. I took a step forward, then another, my shoes barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice calm, steady, as if there was nothing unusual at all. No answer, only silence, thick and heavy. I glanced toward the staircase, my gaze lingering there as that strange feeling settled deeper in my chest. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was something quieter. Something colder. I began to walk up the stairs slowly, one hand lightly brushing the banister, each step deliberate, controlled. Halfway up, I heard it again, clearer this time, the faint creak of a drawer opening. And then a voice. Soft, low, careful. I stopped where I was, my breath catching just slightly as I listened more closely. It was coming from my bedroom, and I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that whoever was inside had no reason to be there. I did not move. Not yet. I stood there on the staircase, my hand resting lightly on the wooden rail, listening in a way I had not listened in years, not since my children were small, and I would pause outside their bedroom doors at night just to make sure they were safe. But this was different. This was not the quiet breathing of a child or the soft rustle of sheets. This was deliberate, controlled. Someone was in my room, and they were being careful. I lowered my foot slowly onto the next step, making sure it did not creak. The house had its own language, one I had learned over 3 decades. I knew which boards protested and which ones stayed silent. I chose my path carefully, step by step, until I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out in front of me, familiar and unchanged, yet it felt foreign in that moment, as if I had walked into someone else's home. The door to my bedroom was not fully closed. It was slightly open, just enough to let a thin line of light spill into the hallway. I could hear the voice again now, clearer than before. It was Ashley. There was no mistaking it. Her voice always carried that polished calm, the kind that sounded pleasant on the surface but never quite reached her eyes. "No, he does not know," she said quietly. There was a pause, as if she was listening to someone on the other end of the call. "I told you, everything is under control. She has no idea." My chest tightened, not with panic, but with something colder, something heavier. I stayed where I was, just outside the door, my breath slow and measured. For a moment, I considered stepping in, announcing myself, forcing the situation into the open. But something inside me held back. Instinct, perhaps, or experience. I had lived long enough to know that the truth reveals itself more clearly when you let people believe they are alone. I leaned slightly closer, just enough to catch her next words. "The documents are exactly where you said they would be," she continued, her voice dropping even lower. I just need a little more time. Once everything is transferred, it will be too late for her to do anything about it. The words settled into me slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. Documents. Transferred. Too late. I did not need her to explain what she meant. I felt it in the quiet certainty that spread through my chest. My eyes moved to the small gap between the door and the frame, and without thinking, I let myself look. Ashley stood near my dresser, her back partially turned toward me. One of the drawers was open, the one where I kept my important papers, neatly organized, always in the same place. She had a folder in her hand, flipping through it with careful precision, her phone pressed between her shoulder and ear. "Yes," she said again, a hint of impatience slipping into her tone. "The house, the accounts, everything. It will all be handled. You just need to trust me." I felt something shift inside me then. Not shock. That had already passed. Not sadness either. That would come later, perhaps. What I felt instead was clarity. A quiet, steady understanding that settled over me like a final piece falling into place. I straightened slightly, stepping back from the door without making a sound. My heart was still beating, but it was no longer unsteady. It was measured, controlled. I turned, just as carefully as I had come, and began to walk back down the hallway. I did not confront her. I did not make my presence known. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, my expression was calm, almost thoughtful. I stepped outside again, closing the door gently behind me, as if nothing had happened at all. The morning air felt different now, sharper, clearer. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, my grocery list still folded in my hand. I had forgotten my wallet. That much was true. But as I walked slowly toward my car, I realized that I had almost forgotten something far more important. I had forgotten that not everyone who smiles at you is on your side. I drove to the supermarket anyway. I do not remember the drive itself, only the way my hands rested on the steering wheel, steady and composed, as if nothing had changed. The parking lot was half full, the usual mix of late morning shoppers pushing carts and loading groceries into their trunks. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did, and for a brief moment, I almost convinced myself that what I had seen upstairs was nothing more than a misunderstanding. But that feeling did not last. I moved through the aisle slowly, picking up the items on my list with the same care I always had. A gallon of milk, a dozen eggs, fresh green beans. I paused in front of the apples, selecting each one carefully, turning them in my hand to check for bruises. It was a small, ordinary routine, one I had repeated hundreds of times over the years. But now, every action felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if I was grounding myself in something familiar while everything else shifted beneath me. Ashley's voice echoed in my mind, calm and certain. She has no idea. The words did not hurt the way I might have expected. They did not sting or burn. They settled quietly, like a fact I had finally acknowledged. By the time I reached the checkout line, my thoughts had already begun to organize themselves. I was not confused. I was not lost. I was thinking. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. Perfectly quiet. I carried the grocery bags inside, placing them on the kitchen counter one by one. I listened, just as I had before, but there was nothing now. No movement. No voice. Only silence. Ashley's car was gone from the driveway. She had left, just as if she had never been there at all. I unpacked the groceries slowly, placing everything where it belonged. The milk in the refrigerator, the vegetables in the crisper drawer, the apples in the ceramic bowl on the counter. When I finished, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stood there for a moment, looking around the kitchen. It was the same kitchen I had cooked in for decades, the same counters, the same cabinets, the same window overlooking the backyard. But something had changed, and I knew it would not change back. I walked upstairs without hesitation this time. There was no need to be careful anymore. The door to my bedroom was closed, just as I had left it earlier. I opened it and stepped inside, my eyes moving immediately to the dresser. The drawer was shut, neat and aligned. If I had not seen it myself, I might have believed nothing had been touched. But I knew better. I crossed the room and opened the drawer slowly. The folders were still there, stacked in the same order, but something about them felt different. I reached in and pulled out the one labeled in my own handwriting, the one that contained the deed to the house, the account statements, the documents my husband had carefully organized before he passed. I flipped through the pages, one by one, my fingers steady, my expression unchanged. At first glance, everything appeared intact. But then I noticed it. A paper slightly out of place. A document I did not remember signing. I pulled it free and held it up, reading each line carefully. My name was there, written in a script that looked like mine, but was not mine. Close enough to pass at a glance. Close enough for someone who did not know me well. I felt a slow breath leave my chest as the realization settled fully into place. This was not carelessness. This was not curiosity. This was planning. Careful, patient planning that had been unfolding right under my roof. I placed the document back into the folder exactly as I had found it, aligning the edges, closing the drawer with quiet precision. Then I sat down on the edge of my bed, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there, looking at the space around me, at the life I had built, at the room that still carried the memory of the man I had shared it with for over 40 years. And in that stillness, something inside me shifted again. Not into anger. Not yet. Into resolve. They believed I did not. No. And for now, that was exactly how I intended to keep it. I remained seated for a long time after that. Long enough for the afternoon light to shift across the floor and climb slowly up the wall, touching the edge of the dresser where those papers still rested. I did not move to check them again. I did not need to. Once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it, and there is no comfort in repeating the proof. Instead, my mind began to do something it had always done in moments of quiet crisis. It went backward, not in panic, but in careful review. I thought about Ashley when she first came into our family, the way she stood in my kitchen with that polite smile, offering to help with dinner, asking questions about recipes she never actually intended to learn. At the time, I had told myself she was simply different. Younger women often were. More focused on efficiency than tradition. Less interested in the small rituals that had once held families together. I had accepted that. I had adjusted. I had made space for her in ways I now realized she had never made space for me. I remembered the first time she suggested reorganizing the house, how she spoke gently, almost sweetly, about making things more convenient for everyone. She had insisted on labeling drawers, moving items into what she called more logical places. I had allowed it, even thanked her, believing it was her way of contributing. But now, sitting there, I understood something I had missed before. She was not organizing the house. She was learning it. Every drawer, every cabinet, every place where something of value might be kept. I thought about the times she had asked casual questions that seemed harmless at the time. Where do you keep your important papers, Margaret? Do you still use the same bank your husband preferred? Do you ever consider simplifying things, maybe putting assets in one place to make it easier for Daniel later on? I had answered her, not because I was careless, but because I believed I was speaking to family. That belief now felt like a quiet kind of foolishness, not loud or dramatic, just a slow recognition of misplaced trust. My gaze drifted to the photograph on my nightstand, the one of my husband taken years ago on a summer afternoon, his expression calm and steady, the way it always was. He had been a careful man, thoughtful, deliberate. He used to say that people show you who they are, but only if you pay attention long enough. At the time, I thought he meant business, contracts, deals. I did not realize he meant everything. I stood up then, smoothing my hands over my skirt, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. There was a certain dignity in small, controlled movements, and I had no intention of losing that now. I walked back to the dresser and opened the drawer once more, this time not to search, but to confirm what I already knew. The documents were still there, arranged as before, but I could see it now without effort. The slight misalignment. The page that did not belong. The signature that was almost mine, but not quite. I closed the drawer gently and turned toward the window, looking out at the backyard where the leaves had just begun to change color. Everything appeared calm, untouched, as if the world itself had no interest in the quiet unraveling taking place inside this house. And perhaps it did not. Most things like this happen without witnesses, without noise. That was the mistake people made. They believed that something significant had to be loud to be real. I knew better. I had lived long enough to understand that the most important shifts happen in silence. By the time I left the room, I had already made a decision. I would not confront her. Not yet. I would not speak to Daniel. Not until I understood exactly how far this had gone. There would be no raised voices, no accusations made in anger. That was not my way, and more importantly, It would not serve me now. If Ashley believed I was unaware, then that belief would become my advantage. I paused at the top of the stairs, my hand resting once again on the banister, the same place I had stood earlier that morning. But this time, the feeling was different. There was no uncertainty left, only clarity. And beneath that, something steady and unshakable. I had spent a lifetime taking care of this family, protecting it, preserving it. I would not allow it to be quietly taken from me piece by piece. Not without understanding exactly who I was dealing with, and not without deciding, very carefully, what I intended to do next. The rest of the day passed quietly, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet I had grown used to. It was sharper now, more deliberate, as if every sound and every silence carried meaning I had once ignored. By the time Daniel and Ashley returned home that evening, I was already in the kitchen, standing by the stove with a pot gently simmering, the scent of roasted chicken and herbs filling the air. It was a familiar scene, one I had repeated countless times over the years, and I made sure everything looked exactly as it always had. When the front door opened, I did not turn immediately. I let them step inside, let their voices fill the space, let the rhythm of their routine settle in before I acknowledged their presence. "Mom, that smells amazing," Daniel said, his tone warm, casual, the way it had always been when he walked into a home he believed was unchanged. I smiled faintly and glanced over my shoulder. "Just something simple," I replied, my voice steady measured. Ashley followed a step behind him, setting her bag down with that same composed grace she always carried. She smiled at me, the expression perfectly practiced, not too wide, not too distant. "It smells wonderful," she said. "You did not have to cook tonight." I met her eyes for just a moment, long enough to see the calm certainty still resting there. If she felt any concern about what she had done earlier, it did not show. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not new behavior. This was habit. "I wanted to," I said simply, turning back to the stove. Dinner unfolded the way it always did. Plates set neatly on the table. Silverware aligned just so. Glasses filled with water. We sat together, the three of us, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface. Daniel spoke about work, about a new project, about numbers and timelines that no longer held much meaning for me. Ashley added comments here and there, asking the right questions, offering the right reactions. She played her role well. She always had. I listened, nodding occasionally, my attention divided between the conversation and the subtle details I might have once overlooked. The way Ashley's gaze flickered toward me when she thought I was not looking. The way she adjusted her posture when certain topics came up. The way she avoided mentioning anything related to finances or the house. Small things, quiet things, but they were there. At one point, Daniel stood to refill his glass, stepping into the kitchen for a moment. Ashley and I were left alone at the table, the space between us suddenly more noticeable than it had ever been before. She reached for her fork, then paused, her eyes lifting to meet mine. "Are you feeling all right today?" she asked, her tone soft, almost concerned. It was a simple question, one that could have meant nothing at all, but I heard the layer beneath it. A test, a careful probe to see if anything had changed. I held her gaze, allowing just a small, polite smile to form. "I am fine," I said. "Why do you ask?" She tilted her head slightly, the gesture gentle, thoughtful. "You just seem a little quiet." I let out a soft breath, as if considering her observation. "I suppose I am just tired," I replied. "It has been a long week." She studied me for a moment longer, her expression still composed, still controlled. Then she nodded lightly and returned her attention to her plate. "Of course," she said. "You should rest more." When Daniel returned, the conversation resumed, and whatever question she had been asking remained unanswered. But I knew she would ask again, in one way or another. She would watch. She would listen. And she would wait for any sign that her careful plan had been disturbed. I finished my meal slowly, placing my fork down with quiet precision when I was done. As I gathered the plates, I felt that same steady clarity settle deeper within me. They believed they understood the situation. They believed they were in control. And for now, I would let them keep that belief. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who is quietly planning is to show them you have noticed. I carried the dishes to the sink, the sound of running water filling the kitchen as I began to wash them, one by one. Behind me, Their voices blended together again, easy and unaware. And as I stood there, my hands moving through a routine I had known for decades, I began to consider something I had not needed to consider in a very long time. Not what had happened, not why, but what I would do about it next. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen, when the house still held that deep, uninterrupted silence that comes just before the day begins. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, allowing my thoughts to settle into place without rushing them. There was no confusion left now, no uncertainty. Only a quiet awareness of what needed to be done, and more importantly, how it needed to be done. I got out of bed slowly, moving through my usual routine with the same calm precision I had shown the night before. I made my bed. I brushed my hair. I chose my clothes carefully, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would draw attention. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, the house was still empty. Daniel and Ashley would not be up for another hour. That gave me time. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, not to relax, but to think. I had spent years managing a household, raising a son, supporting a husband who believed in planning ahead for everything. Those habits do not disappear with age. They become sharper, more deliberate. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it in the sink before making my way to the small desk in the corner of the living room. It was where I kept my personal records, my address book, and a few items that no one else paid much attention to. I opened the drawer and took out an old notebook, one I had not used in years. Its pages were still mostly blank. That would change. I sat down and began to write. Not emotions, not accusations. Facts, dates, observations. The morning Ashley had asked about my accounts. The afternoon she insisted on reorganizing the house. The document I found the day before. The exact wording I had overheard. I wrote everything down carefully, in clear, steady handwriting, as if I were preparing something that would need to be understood by someone else later. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, exactly where it had been. Then I stood, smoothing my hands over my skirt once more, and reached for my phone. There was one person I needed to speak to. I had not called him in over 2 years, not since shortly after my husband passed, but I knew his number by heart. Some things you do not forget. The phone rang twice before he answered. "This is Martin Reynolds," he said, his voice older now, but still carrying that same steady professionalism I remembered. "Martin," I said, my tone calm, composed. "This is Margaret Collins." There was a brief pause, and then a shift in his voice, recognition settling in. "Margaret, it has been a long time." "Yes," I replied. "It has." I did not explain everything. Not yet. That would come later, in person, where details could be handled properly. "I need to review some documents," I said, "and I would prefer to do so with you." Another pause, shorter this time. "Of course," he said. "When would you like to come in?" I glanced toward the window, where the first light of morning was beginning to filter through. "Today," I answered, "if that is possible." "It is," he said without hesitation. "I will make time." I thanked him, ended the call, and placed the phone back on the table. For a moment, I stood there in the quiet, listening to the faint sounds of the house beginning to wake. A door upstairs. Soft footsteps. The start of another ordinary day. But it was not ordinary anymore. Not for me. I moved toward the kitchen, preparing breakfast just as I always did, eggs and toast, the smell of coffee filling the air once again. When Daniel and Ashley came downstairs, they would see the same routine, the same calm, the same woman they believed they understood. And I would let them believe it. Because the truth is, there is a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is immediate, emotional, visible. Responding is patient, controlled, and often invisible until it is too late to stop. I had no intention of reacting. I had already begun to respond. Breakfast unfolded just as I expected it would, with the same quiet rhythm that had defined this house for years. Daniel sat at the table scrolling through his phone, half listening as Ashley spoke about her schedule for the day, her voice light and controlled, every word placed carefully as if she had rehearsed it. I moved between the stove and the table, setting plates down in front of them, pouring coffee, making sure everything appeared exactly as it always had. There is a certain comfort people find in routine, and I intended to preserve that illusion for as long as it served me. "Do you have any plans today, Mom?" Daniel asked, glancing up briefly before returning his attention to his screen. His tone was casual, almost absent, but I heard the question for what it was. Not curiosity, not concern, just habit. I placed a slice of toast on his plate and smiled faintly. I thought I might run a few errands, I said. Nothing important. Ashley's fork paused for the smallest fraction of a second before continuing as if nothing had changed. It was subtle, the kind of reaction most people would miss. But I did not miss it. That sounds nice, she said, her voice smooth. You have been staying in a lot lately. It is good to get out. I nodded once, taking my seat across from them, my posture relaxed, my expression calm. Yes, I said. It is. We ate in silence for a few moments, the clink of silverware against plates filling the space between us. Then Ashley spoke again, this time more carefully. If you need help with anything, she added, you can always let us know. I looked at her then, meeting her eyes fully, allowing just enough warmth to remain in my expression to make my words believable. I appreciate that, I said. I will keep it in mind. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, searching for something, perhaps a shift, perhaps a crack in the surface she expected to see. But there was nothing there for her to find. When breakfast ended, Daniel left first, grabbing his keys and heading out the door with a quick goodbye that echoed faintly through the hallway. Ashley lingered a moment longer, wiping her hands with a napkin, her movements unhurried, deliberate. I might be late tonight, she said as she stood. There is something I need to take care of after work. I nodded, as if this were a simple piece of information with no weight behind it. Of course, I replied. Take your time. She watched me again, just briefly, then offered that same practiced smile before turning and leaving the room. A few minutes later, I heard the front door close. The house returned to silence. I did not move right away. I remained seated at the table, my hands folded neatly in front of me, listening as the last traces of their presence faded completely. Then, slowly I stood. I cleaned the kitchen the way I always did, rinsing plates, wiping counters, placing everything back in its proper place. Each movement was steady, controlled, unhurried. By the time I finished, there was no sign that breakfast had ever happened. I dried my hands and reached for my purse, checking once more that my wallet was inside this time. Then I walked to the front door, pausing only briefly before stepping outside. The drive to Martin's office was longer than I remembered, or perhaps it only felt that way because of the weight of what I was carrying with me. The roads were familiar, the traffic light, the sky clear above me, but my attention was focused inward, reviewing everything I knew, everything I had seen, everything I had written down that morning. When I arrived, I parked carefully and sat in the car for a moment before turning off the engine. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting nothing, simply confirming what I already knew. I looked exactly the same. Calm, composed, unchanged. That was important. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, my pace steady, my shoulders straight. Inside, the receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to wait. I took a seat in the small waiting area, folding my hands in my lap once again, my posture relaxed, my breathing even. A few minutes later, Martin appeared in the doorway, older than I remembered, but still carrying himself with the same quiet authority. "Margaret," he said, offering a small, respectful nod. I stood to meet him, returning the gesture with equal calm. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," I said. He gestured for me to follow him into his office, closing the door behind us with a soft, final click. As I took my seat across from him, I felt that same clarity settle into place once more. Whatever had been unfolding in my home was no longer just something I had observed. It was something I was now prepared to address, carefully, precisely, and on my own terms. Martin did not speak immediately after I sat down. He studied me for a moment, the way he always had, as if measuring not just what I said, but what I chose not to say. Then he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and gave a small nod. "Tell me what is going on," he said. His tone was calm, professional, but there was something else beneath it. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. I reached into my purse and removed the folder I had brought with me, placing it carefully on the desk between us. "I need you to look at these," I said, "and I need you to tell me exactly what you see." He opened the folder without hesitation, adjusting his glasses slightly as he began to review the documents one by one. I did not interrupt him. I did not explain. I let the silence do its work. The only sound in the room was the soft turning of paper, steady and methodical. After a few minutes, he stopped. not abruptly, but with a subtle shift that told me he had found what he needed. He looked up at me, his expression no longer neutral. "Did you sign this?" he asked, tapping lightly on the page I had already recognized. I met his gaze without hesitation. "No," I said. He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "It is a very careful imitation," he said. "Close enough to pass without scrutiny, especially if no one is expecting a problem." I did not respond. There was nothing to add. He continued reviewing the rest of the documents, his movements slightly more deliberate now, his attention sharpened. When he finished, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "This is not a mistake," he said. "This is intentional." I let out a slow breath, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. "I know," I replied. He studied me again, more closely this time. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" I allowed a brief pause, not because I needed time to think, but because I understood the importance of how things are said. "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." He did not press me for a name. He did not need to. Instead, he nodded again, his expression settling into something firm, focused. "All right," he said. "Then we proceed carefully." That word again. Carefully. It was the right word. The only word. "First," he continued, "we need to secure everything that can be secured immediately. Accounts, titles, any document that could be altered or transferred. We make sure there is no opportunity for further damage." I listened, absorbing each step without interruption. "Second," he said, "we document everything. Not just what you have brought me, but anything else you have noticed. Dates, conversations, patterns. The more precise we are, the stronger your position will be." I thought of the notebook in my drawer, the careful notes I had already begun to write. "I have started that," I said. He gave a small, approving nod. "Good," he replied. "Then we are ahead of this." He paused briefly, then leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal the importance of what came next. "And third," he said, "we do not confront anyone yet." I met his gaze again, feeling that same steady clarity settle deeper within me. "I had no intention of doing that," I said. A faint expression of understanding crossed his face. "I thought as much," he replied. He reached for a pen and began making a few notes of his own, his handwriting precise, controlled. "We will also prepare a contingency," he added, "in case this escalates, or in case there are additional attempts made." I nodded once. "Do whatever you think is necessary," I said. "I trust your judgment." He looked up at that, holding my gaze for a moment longer than before. "Your husband trusted me as well," he said, "and I intend to honor that." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Not uncertain, not heavy. It was structured, intentional. When the meeting ended, I gathered my things and stood, smoothing my hands lightly over my skirt once more. "Thank you, Martin," I said. He rose as well, giving a small nod. "We will handle this," he replied. "One step at a time." I left his office with the same steady pace I had entered with, stepping back out into the late morning light. The air felt different now, not because anything outside had changed, but because something inside me had settled into place completely. I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was preparing for what would come next. And for the first time since I stood at the top of those stairs, listening to a voice that was not meant for me to hear, I knew with absolute certainty that I was not the one at a disadvantage. By the time I returned home that afternoon, everything was already in motion, though nothing on the surface had changed. The house stood exactly as it had that morning, quiet, orderly, untouched by the decisions that had begun to reshape what would come next. I stepped inside, placing my purse on the small table near the door, and listened for a moment out of habit. Silence. Predictable, controlled silence. I moved through the house slowly, not searching, not checking, simply observing. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Each space carried the same appearance it always had, but I no longer looked at it with the same eyes. I saw it now as something that had been studied, mapped, and quietly targeted. That understanding no longer unsettled me. It clarified everything. When Daniel and Ashley returned that evening, I was ready. Not in a dramatic sense. Not in a way that would draw attention. I was simply prepared. Dinner was already set, the table arranged with the same care I had shown every night before. There is a certain power in consistency. It makes people comfortable. It lowers their guard. "You have been busy," Daniel said as he walked in, loosening his tie, his voice carrying that familiar ease. You did not have to do all this. I smiled faintly, adjusting a glass slightly so it aligned perfectly with the plate. I wanted to, I said. Ashley stepped in behind him, her eyes moving briefly across the room before settling on me. She was always observing, always measuring, even when she appeared relaxed. Everything looks beautiful, she said. It really does. I nodded once, acknowledging the compliment without lingering on it. We sat down together, the same arrangement, the same routine. But tonight, there was something else beneath it. Something neither of them could quite identify. Conversation began as it always did. Light, unremarkable, centered around Daniel's work, the weather, small details that filled space without meaning. I allowed it to continue for a while, listening, responding when appropriate, maintaining the rhythm they expected. Then, at a moment that felt neither forced nor abrupt, I set my fork down gently and looked at Daniel. I stopped by Martin Reynolds' office today, I said. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Daniel looked up, his expression shifting slightly in confusion. Ashley's hand paused just briefly before continuing, her composure intact, but not untouched. Martin, Daniel asked. Dad's attorney? I nodded. Yes. I kept my tone even, neutral, as if I were discussing something routine. I wanted to review a few documents. It has been some time since I looked at everything closely. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering this. Is something wrong? He asked. I held his gaze, not with accusation, not with urgency, but with a calm that required attention. There were a few things that needed clarification, I said. That was all. I did not elaborate. I did not accuse. I allowed the weight of the words to settle on their own. Ashley set her fork down carefully, her movements precise. What kind of things? She asked, her voice controlled, but now carrying a note that had not been there before. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. I turned my attention to her then, meeting her eyes fully, allowing a small, composed smile to return. The kind that are better handled properly, I said, with the right documentation in place. Silence followed. Not long. Just enough. Daniel glanced between us, sensing something he could not yet define. Ashley remained still, her expression carefully maintained, but I could see it now without effort. The calculation, the adjustment, the shift in her understanding of the situation. I reached for my glass and took a small sip of water, setting it back down with quiet precision. Martin will be helping me reorganize a few things, I added, just to make sure everything is exactly where it should be. Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the explanation at face value, though his confusion had not fully faded. That makes sense, he said. It is probably a good idea. Ashley did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was as smooth as ever, but something beneath it had changed. Of course, she said. It is always good to be careful. I held her gaze for a moment longer, then returned my attention to my plate, picking up my fork as if the conversation had reached its natural end. And in a way it had, because nothing more needed to be said. Not yet. They understood enough. Not everything. Not the full extent of what had already begun, but enough to feel the shift. Enough to realize that something they believed was secure was no longer within their control. Dinner continued after that, but the tone had changed. Subtly, permanently. And as I sat there, moving through the familiar motions of a meal shared at the same table I had set for years, I felt no anger. No urgency. Only that same steady certainty that had been building since the moment I stood at the top of those stairs. They had believed I would not notice. They had believed I would not understand. And most of all, they had believed I would not act. That was their mistake. Not what they had done, but what they had assumed about me. An elderly mother thought she was simply returning home after a small mistake, but what she discovered inside her own bedroom revealed a quiet betrayal that had been unfolding right in front of her eyes. In this deeply emotional and gripping entry from Family Stories, the mother begins to uncover how her daughter-in-law has been carefully manipulating access to personal documents and financial control, all while maintaining a perfect image of care and respect. As the truth slowly surfaces, the story captures the silent strength of a woman who chooses patience over confrontation, strategy over emotion, and clarity over chaos. This powerful narrative from Family Stories explores the subtle dynamics of trust, control, and deception within a household where appearances are carefully maintained but intentions run far deeper. Through calm observation and calculated action, the mother begins to reclaim her position, working with a trusted legal advisor while allowing her daughter-in-law to believe everything is still under control. As tension builds in quiet conversations and ordinary family dinners, the emotional weight of the story grows, revealing how easily loyalty can be misplaced and how dangerous assumptions can be when someone is underestimated. This unforgettable addition to family stories highlights the resilience of an older woman who refuses to be dismissed or deceived, showing that strength does not always need to be loud to be effective. With each moment carefully unfolding, the balance of power shifts, and what began as a simple day becomes a turning point that neither the mother nor the daughter-in-law will ever forget. For viewers who are drawn to realistic, emotional, and thought-provoking family stories, this narrative offers a compelling look at hidden motives, quiet intelligence, and the kind of justice that comes not from confrontation, but from understanding and control. In the end, this is more than just one of many family stories. It is a reflection of how awareness, patience, and dignity can reshape even the most difficult family relationships. Character 1 is a 71-year-old white woman with calm, composed expression. She wears modest, elegant house dress. Front-facing portrait with natural lighting. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Subtle, aging details. Serious, intelligent presence. Character 2 is a 35-year-old white woman with polished, attractive face and controlled expression. She wears modern, stylish clothing. Front-facing portrait with natural lighting. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Subtle, manipulative presence.